The Ardennes winter of 1944–45 refused to release its grip. Even as the last German panzers limped back across the Aar River, the snow remained, deep, wet, and treacherous, blanketing the shattered forests where American soldiers had paid in blood to stop Hitler's final gamble. The Battle of the Bulge had ended not with a decisive Allied triumph, but with exhaustion on both sides. By January 1945, the front had congealed again into something resembling a line. The German offensive had been contained, its armored thrust blunted at Bastogne, Elsenborn Ridge, St. Vith, and a dozen other places written now in frost and frozen corpses. Yet the victory felt hollow. American casualties approached 90,000, killed, wounded, missing, frostbitten. Divisions had been mauled, supply lines had nearly collapsed, and beneath the tactical success lay a deeper wound that no amount of snow could cover. The alliance itself had begun to bleed. On the morning of January 7, 1945, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery summoned the press to his headquarters at Zonhoven, near Brussels. The room was cold, the correspondents still wearing their heavy coats, many of them American reporters who had spent weeks embedded with troops north of the Bulge. Montgomery entered precisely on time, beret angled, tunic immaculate, the very image of unruffled British authority. He spoke for nearly an hour without notes, his voice calm, measured, almost pedagogical. He began by praising Eisenhower's overall direction of the campaign. He acknowledged the extraordinary bravery of American troops. Then he moved to the heart of his statement. "As soon as I saw what was happening," he said, "I took certain steps myself to ensure that if the Germans got to the Meuse, they would certainly not get over the river." He described how, on December 20th, Eisenhower had placed the U.S. First Army under Hodges and the Ninth Army under Simpson, directly under his, Montgomery's, command. That decision, he implied, had been the fulcrum on which the entire battle turned. "The situation was saved," he continued, "because of the measures I took." The temporary transfer of 2 entire American armies to British command had restored order where confusion had threatened disaster. The reporters scribbled furiously. When the dispatch wires carried Montgomery's words across the Atlantic that afternoon, they landed like a second German artillery barrage. American soldiers who had held the frozen line for weeks, who had watched friends die in the snow at Barak Michel or in the woods outside Manhay, felt the statement as a personal insult. They had not been saved by British intervention. They had survived by sheer stubbornness until reinforcements could arrive. Generals reacted with cold fury. Omar Bradley, whose 12th Army Group had been physically cut in two by the German thrust, saw the press conference as a direct attempt to rewrite history at American expense. George Patton, whose Third Army had executed the brutal northern hook to relieve Bastogne, called it the most disgusting thing I've ever seen in my life, and demanded that Eisenhower allow him to respond publicly. Even in Washington, the newspapers picked up the scent. Montgomery had claimed credit for rescuing the Americans from their own mistakes. That same evening, in the map room at SHAEF Forward in Versailles, Dwight D. Eisenhower sat alone. The great headquarters had gone quiet after the day's briefings. Advisors had departed. The phones were silent. Only the hooded lamps remained on, casting long shadows across the wall of maps that dominated the room. The Rhine lay ahead like a dark promise, still more than 200 miles of enemy territory away, but Eisenhower's attention was fixed on the configuration north of the Ardennes. First Army had already been returned to Bradley's control on January 17th, as soon as the immediate crisis passed. Ninth Army, however, remained under Montgomery's operational command. The Field Marshal had made it clear he considered that arrangement both logical and necessary for the coming phase of the war. Montgomery's philosophy was not subtle. Meticulous preparation, centralized authority, controlled tempo, overwhelming force applied at the decisive point. To him, the Bulge had been a textbook demonstration of what happened when those principles were ignored. American commanders, in his view, had been caught flat-footed. Improvisation had nearly cost them the front. British experience and discipline had restored balance. Therefore, the temporary command of American armies should, logically, become permanent, at least until the Rhine was crossed and the final drive into Germany began. Eisenhower understood the man. Montgomery was not driven by petty ego or national chauvinism alone. He was driven by conviction. unshakable, almost religious, that there was one correct way to wage modern war, and that he embodied it. Any deviation from that method was not merely mistaken, it was dangerous. To place the final phase of the campaign in the hands of commanders who had, in his eyes, already proven themselves prone to error would be to squander the victory that now seemed within reach. Montgomery did not want power for its own sake. He wanted power because he believed he alone could be trusted to use it correctly. Eisenhower did not share that certainty. He had spent 3 years forging the Anglo-American alliance into a functioning weapon. He had balanced national sensitivities, soothed wounded egos, subordinated personal ambition to the common cause. He knew the arithmetic of 1945. American divisions now outnumbered British and Canadian forces by more than 3-1. To leave 2 American armies permanently under British command risked not only resentment among the troops, it risked fracture at the highest levels. Bradley had already confided that he would resign rather than serve indefinitely under Montgomery. Patton's loyalty was to Eisenhower personally, but his temper was volcanic. Any hint of British dominance could provoke an explosion that would echo across the Atlantic. Yet Eisenhower could not simply relieve Montgomery. To sack Britain's most famous field commander, fresh from the Normandy campaign, darling of the British press, trusted confidant of Churchill, would be a political catastrophe. London would see it as an American power grab at the moment Britain's strategic influence was already waning. Churchill, navigating the painful reality of Britain's junior status in the alliance, could not afford such a public humiliation. Eisenhower rose and walked slowly along the map table. His finger traced the line of the Rhine. Montgomery was already planning Operation Plunder, a massive, set-piece assault, meticulously rehearsed, supported by airborne divisions, artillery concentrations, and every ounce of logistical preparation British staff work could muster. It would be textbook Montgomery. Slow, deliberate, overwhelming. Patton, meanwhile, was already probing southward, restless, impatient, convinced that speed and opportunism could carry American forces across the river weeks earlier. 2 philosophies confronted each other across that map: control versus audacity, caution versus risk, unity through centralized authority versus unity through mutual trust. And between them stood Eisenhower, alone in the silent room, responsible for both armies and for the coalition that bound them. He had always believed that coalitions were fragile instruments, held together not by firepower, but by shared purpose and forbearance. Now that purpose felt strained almost to breaking by the weight of one man's absolute certainty. For the first time, Eisenhower feared the war could still be lost, without another German shot being fired. The days following Montgomery's January 7 press conference were quiet on the surface, but the silence was the kind that precedes a detonation. Cables flew between Versailles and London, between SHAEF and 12th Army Group headquarters in Luxembourg, between Bradley's command post and Patton's mobile headquarters somewhere east of Bastogne. The public story remained one of steady progress. The Ardennes Bulge had been pinched off, German reserves were spent, Allied air forces were once again masters of the sky. Beneath that narrative, however, a different war was being fought, one of memoranda, telephone calls, and the careful calibration of outrage. Montgomery did not retreat from his position. On the contrary, he pressed it forward with the same methodical persistence he brought to every operation. In a series of private messages to Eisenhower, he argued that the coming phase of the war, the advance to the Rhine and the crossing itself, demanded the same unified command structure that had stabilized the northern shoulder during the Bulge. The 9th Army, he insisted, should remain under 21st Army Group control, not as a temporary expedient, but as a permanent arrangement until the Rhine had been secured and the bridgehead firmly established. To fragment command now, he wrote, would be to invite the very confusion that had nearly proved fatal in December. Eisenhower read the messages in his office at the Trianon Palace, the same room where he had once hosted the surrender of the German forces in North Africa. He did not reply immediately. Instead, he summoned Bradley and Patton to Versailles for what the official record would describe as a routine coordination conference. Bradley arrived first, gaunt from weeks of sleepless nights, his usual calm demeanor edged with something harder. He did not waste words. "Ike," he said, using the private name he reserved for moments of maximum candor. "If Ninth Army stays under Monty any longer than absolutely necessary, I'll have to ask to be relieved. I can't ask my boys to fight under a commander who believes they need saving from themselves." Patton arrived an hour later, cigar already lit, his face flushed from the cold and from barely contained rage. He had brought a map of his own, one that showed Third Army's recent movements with aggressive red arrows pushing toward the German frontier. "If you leave Simpson's boys with Monty," he told Eisenhower bluntly, "you'll lose the war of morale before you lose a single division. My men will mutiny. Hell, I may join them." Eisenhower listened without interruption. He had known both men for years, understood their strengths and their limits. Bradley was the moral center of the American command, steady, professional, deeply respected by the troops. Patton was the necessary edge, the commander who could drive men beyond what they thought possible, even if he sometimes drove them past the breaking point. To lose either would be crippling. To lose both would be fatal to the coalition. The conference lasted into the evening. No final decision was reached, but the ultimatum was clear. Permanent British command of American armies was unacceptable. The alliance could not survive it. Eisenhower spent the next days in consultation with his Chief of Staff, Walter Bedell Beadle Smith, and with Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder, his British deputy, who had become one of the few men capable of speaking frankly to both Eisenhower and Montgomery. Tedder was blunt. "Monty believes he is saving the alliance from American impetuosity," he told Eisenhower. "He does not see that he is endangering it by insisting on his own supremacy." Churchill, too, was drawn into the quiet storm. The Prime Minister had already accepted the reality of Britain's diminished role. American production and manpower now dominated the Western Front. Yet he could not allow Montgomery, a national hero, the victor of El Alamein, the architect of the Normandy breakout, to be publicly humiliated. In a series of late-night telephone conversations, Churchill proposed a compromise. First Army would be returned to Bradley immediately, as the emergency had passed. Ninth Army would remain under Montgomery only for the duration of the Rhine crossing operation, plunder, and then revert to American control. The arrangement would be temporary, clearly defined and documented in formal orders. Eisenhower agreed in principle. He understood the political necessity, but he also understood something deeper. This was no longer merely a question of command arrangements. It was a test. Montgomery's philosophy held that power, once granted for good reason, should be retained as long as the holder deemed it necessary. Eisenhower's philosophy held that power was loaned, not owned, and that the lender retained the right to recall it when trust began to erode. He signed the directive on January 20th, 1945. First Army returned to 12th Army Group. Ninth Army would operate under 21st Army Group for Operation Plunder, the massive British-Canadian crossing scheduled for late March. The compromise appeared balanced on paper. American pride was preserved, British prestige was protected, and the alliance moved forward. But Eisenhower did not sleep easily that night. He knew Montgomery too well. The Field Marshal would interpret the retention of Ninth Army not as a loan, but as vindication. Each concession, however limited, would become the precedent for the next. The Rhine crossing would be presented as proof that centralized British command was superior. And when the crossing succeeded, as it almost certainly would, Montgomery would argue that the same command structure must continue into the final advance. Eisenhower returned to the map room after midnight. The pins marking Ninth Army's position were still clustered along the Roer River, under Montgomery's operational control. He stared at them for a long time. The alliance was intact, for now. The front was advancing. Victory was coming, yet he felt the ground shifting beneath his feet, not from German resistance, but from the slow, inexorable pressure of one man's unyielding certainty. Any choice now would create an enemy. The only question was which kind. The compromise, once committed to paper, carried the weight of fragile porcelain. On January 20th, 1945, Eisenhower signed the directive that formally returned the U.S. First Army to Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group. The order was crisp, unambiguous, and immediate. Courtney Hodges' headquarters shifted its reporting chain back to Luxembourg without ceremony. The move was announced quietly in the daily situation reports. No press conference, no victory fanfare. It was simply done. Ninth Army, however, remained where Montgomery wanted it, for the moment. The directive stipulated that William Simpson's force would continue under 21st Group operational control for the preparation and execution of Operation Plunder, the planned Rhine crossing north of the Ruhr. The language was careful, temporary, purpose-limited, subject to review once the bridgehead was secure. Eisenhower had insisted on those qualifiers. Montgomery accepted them without visible objection. To the outside world, the arrangement appeared equitable. American honor restored in the north, British prestige preserved for the decisive blow across the river. Behind closed doors, Eisenhower began his private campaign. He did not confront Montgomery directly. Confrontation would only harden the field marshal's position and invite political intervention from London. Instead, Eisenhower chose observation. He would grant the limited authority Montgomery sought and watch, very carefully, to see what use was made of it. Trust, he had come to understand in the long nights of January, was not given. It was observed. And what he observed in the weeks that followed would determine how far he could allow the leash to extend. Montgomery's headquarters at Zonhoven became a hive of meticulous preparation. Plunder was taking shape as the largest amphibious assault operation since Normandy. 2 armies, 2nd British and 1st Canadian, 9 divisions, 5,000 artillery pieces, 5,000 boats and rafts, 2 airborne divisions, and a massive smokescreen to blind German gunners on the far bank. The planning was textbook Montgomery. Every bridge, every ferry, every barrage timed to the minute. Ninth Army, now the northernmost American formation, was integrated into the scheme with precision. General Simpson, a tall, soft-spoken Texan, known for his professionalism and lack of theatrics, worked smoothly with his British counterparts. There was no friction on the surface. Simpson followed orders, coordinated artillery, rehearsed river crossings, and expressed nothing but respect for the operation's scale. Eisenhower monitored the reports daily. He noted the tone of the messages between 21st Army Group and 9th Army headquarters. They were correct, efficient, almost collegial. Yet he also noted something subtler, the gradual expansion of language. Montgomery's staff began referring to 9th Army not as attached for plunder, but as under command for the northern thrust. Planning documents started to include contingency lines that assumed 9th Army would remain in place after the crossing to exploit the bridgehead eastward alongside the British 2nd Army. The assumption was never stated outright. It did not need to be. It was embedded in the maps, in the logistics tables, in the rhythm of daily orders. Eisenhower said nothing. He let the assumption grow, like a plant being tested for resilience. Simultaneously, he maintained contact with Bradley and Patton. Bradley, though relieved to have 1st Army back, remained wary. He understood the larger game. "You're giving him rope, Ike," he said during one of their secure telephone calls. "I just hope you know how much he'll take before he hangs himself with it." Patton was less philosophical. His 3rd Army was now driving hard toward the Eifel and the Moselle, probing for weak points, ready to exploit any opportunity to cross the Rhine before the Great British set piece. "If Monty gets to keep Simpson's boys after the river," Patton growled, "I'll take my army across somewhere else and let him explain to the folks back home why the American thrust came from the south while he was still building pontoons." Eisenhower listened to both men. He did not promise outcomes. He asked only for patience. In London, Winston Churchill followed the situation with the weary attention of a man watching his country's last great military card being played. He telephoned Eisenhower more frequently now, the conversations a mixture of strategy and politics. "Monty must have his moment," Churchill said one evening. "The British public expects it, but I trust you, Dwight, to see that no lasting injury is done to the larger structure." It was as close as Churchill would come to granting Eisenhower permission to draw the line when the moment came. Eisenhower understood the subtext. Britain's strategic influence was receding like a tide that would not return. The final act of the European war would be American in manpower, American in momentum, American in the eyes of history. Churchill knew it. Montgomery, in his heart, refused to accept it. And that refusal was what Eisenhower now measured every day. By mid-February, as the Allied line crept forward toward the Roer and the Rhine, Eisenhower had seen enough. The temporary command of Ninth Army had not been used to build trust. It had been used to extend authority. The pattern was clear. Each concession became the foundation for the next claim. Montgomery did not scheme in darkness. He believed, deeply, sincerely, that the alliance would be better served if the final phase were conducted according to his principles. But belief without restraint, Eisenhower realized, was as dangerous as any enemy division. He began drafting private notes, contingency orders that would never be shown to Montgomery unless necessary. They were simple, one-page documents that would restore Ninth Army to Bradley the moment the Rhine bridgehead was declared secure. No fanfare, no public explanation, just the quiet recall of loaned power. As the thaw came and the rivers swelled, Eisenhower felt the weight of the decision settling into place. He was not punishing Montgomery. He was protecting the coalition from the consequences of one man's certainty. Trust, Eisenhower realized, was not given, it was observed. March 1945 arrived like a promise kept too late. The ground had softened into mud, the rivers were high with snowmelt, and the Allied line, after weeks of grinding attritional advance, finally stood on the western bank of the Rhine. The last German defenses west of the river had crumbled under relentless pressure from the air and the ground. What remained was the crossing itself, the final barrier, symbolic as much as military, between the War of Liberation and the War of Conquest. Montgomery's Operation Plunder was ready. 24 hours before the assault, the northern sector resembled an armed city. 5,000 artillery pieces stood wheel to wheel along 30 miles of front. Searchlights, smoke generators, and assault boats waited in concealed positions. The 2nd British Army and 1st Canadian Army were poised, rehearsed to the last detail. 9th Army, still under 21st Army Group Command, formed the right flank. Simpson's divisions integrated seamlessly into the plan. Montgomery had insisted on it, and Eisenhower had allowed it. The Field Marshal would have his moment. At 1800 hours on March 23rd, the artillery opened. The roar was continuous, a wall of sound that could be heard in Holland. Searchlights bounced off low clouds, turning night into artificial day. Smoke screens rolled across the river, thick and choking. Then came the boats, hundreds of them, carrying infantry across the 300-yard width under a hail of sporadic German fire. Airborne divisions dropped behind the far bank in the early hours of March 24th. By midday, the bridgeheads were linked. By March 25th, pontoon bridges were in place, tanks were crossing, and the breakout had begun. Operation Plunder was a success, methodical, overwhelming, textbook. Montgomery's communiques were restrained, but unmistakable. Centralized planning and combined arms had delivered the Rhine intact. Far to the south, however, another crossing had already taken place. George Patton had not waited. On the night of March 22 to 23, hours before Plunder's artillery opened, 3rd Army's 5th Infantry Division slipped across the Rhine at Oppenheim, south of Mainz, in a hasty, improvised assault. No massive barrage, no weeks of rehearsal, no airborne drop. Just infantry in assault boats, covered by darkness and the surprise of audacity. By dawn on March 23rd, a small bridgehead existed. By March 24th, engineers had a pontoon bridge across, and Patton's tanks were pouring over. Within 48 hours, 3rd Army had expanded the bridgehead to 9 miles deep and was driving northeast toward Frankfurt. Patton's crossing was not larger than Plunder. It was not better supplied, but it was earlier, by almost exactly 24 hours, and it was American. The news reached SHAEF almost immediately. Bradley called Eisenhower at once. Patton's across. He didn't ask permission. He just did it. Eisenhower's first reaction was not anger. It was something closer to relief. The river had been crossed on American terms, by American speed, without waiting for the great British set piece. The balance had shifted, not by design, but by the inevitable momentum of two different philosophies colliding with reality. Montgomery's response was predictable. He congratulated Patton publicly, a brief, correct message, then quietly expanded his own plans. With the northern bridgehead secure, he proposed that 9th Army continue eastward under his command to link with the British 2nd Army in a drive toward the Ruhr pocket. The argument was logical on its face. Momentum must be maintained. The Ruhr was the industrial heart, Unified command would prevent confusion in the converging attacks. In private messages to Eisenhower, Montgomery wrote of the desirability of maintaining the present command structure until the Ruhr is eliminated. The temporary had become habitual. The loan was being quietly converted into ownership. Eisenhower read the proposal in silence. He had expected it. He had watched it develop for weeks. The subtle shift in staff language, the inclusion of Ninth Army in follow-on phases, the assumption that success proved the method. Plunder's victory had not humbled Montgomery. It had confirmed him. Each success under his command became evidence that his command should continue. Patton's early crossing had done something else. It had reminded Eisenhower and the world that there was another way to win, not through exhaustive preparation, but through opportunism, risk, and unrelenting pressure. The two crossings stood in stark contrast across the map. Plunder was a symphony of control. Oppenheim was a sudden, sharp note of improvisation. Both worked, but only one philosophy could dominate the endgame. Eisenhower did not rush his decision. He allowed Plunder to unfold fully. He let Simpson's divisions advance alongside the British for another week, securing the northern Ruhr approaches. He watched the reports, the casualty figures, the pace of advance. Ninth Army performed superbly, disciplined, aggressive, professional. Simpson himself never complained, never pushed against the chain of command. Yet the longer the arrangement continued, the clearer the pattern became. Temporary power had not restrained ambition. It had revealed it. By the end of March, the Ruhr pocket was forming. German resistance was collapsing everywhere. The end was visible. And with visibility came clarity. Eisenhower drafted the final order in his own hand, short, unambiguous, and without apology. Effective upon the securement of the Rhine bridgehead and the initial exploitation phase, Ninth Army would revert to 12th Army Group control. No extension, no further discussion. The river had been crossed, the bridgehead was firm, the purpose of the attachment had been fulfilled. He did not frame it as punishment, he framed it as logic. But he knew Montgomery would read it differently. The river had been crossed, but the line Eisenhower was watching had not. April 4, 1945. The Ruhr pocket was nearly sealed. German divisions, once the backbone of the Wehrmacht, were being compressed into shrinking perimeters, their supply lines severed, their fuel tanks empty. Allied armies advanced almost unopposed. The end of the war in Europe was measured now not in months, but in days. Yet at SHAEF forward in Reims, where the headquarters had moved to be closer to the front, the atmosphere was not one of triumph. It was one of quiet, deliberate finality. Eisenhower's order was brief, one paragraph, typed on a single sheet, classified eyes only until execution. Effective 001 hours, April 4, 1945, the U.S. Ninth Army, under Lieutenant General William H. Simpson, would revert to the command of 12th Army Group. The attachment to 21st Army Group was terminated. Ninth Army would immediately align its operations, logistics, and reporting chain with Omar Bradley's headquarters. No extension would be granted, no further discussion invited. The order reached Montgomery's headquarters at Walbeck Castle the same morning. His chief of staff, Major General Francis de Gand, read it first and understood instantly. He took it to the field marshal without comment. Montgomery stood motionless for several seconds, then placed the paper on his desk. He did not shout, he did not telephone London. He simply said, "Very well," and returned to the map table. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible, but those who knew him recognized it as the closest he would ever come to acknowledging defeat. There was no public explosion, no press conference, no formal protest to Churchill. Montgomery understood the political arithmetic as clearly as Eisenhower did. Any open challenge now would only confirm the narrative that British influence was being deliberately diminished. The war was being won. To fracture the alliance at the moment of victory would be unforgivable in the eyes of history, and in the eyes of the British people, who still looked to him as the man who had turned the tide at El Alamein. Instead, Montgomery complied. Ninth Army headquarters shifted its reporting chain southward to Bradley within hours. Simpson's divisions continued their advance, now coordinated with Courtney Hodges's 1st Army on the left and Patton's 3rd on the right. The momentum did not falter. The Ruhr pocket closed on April 18th. Berlin fell in early May. The Germans surrendered unconditionally on May 7th. The war ended, on time, on schedule, with the alliance intact. But the cost was paid in silence. Eisenhower never spoke publicly of the episode in the way Montgomery might have. His post-war memoirs described the command adjustments of early 1945 as necessary administrative measures, taken in the interest of operational efficiency. No mention of ultimatums, no discussion of threatened resignations, no reference to the nights spent alone in map rooms weighing the survival of coalition against the survival of certainty. He understood that history prefers simple narratives, the great commander who held the alliance together, the steady hand that guided victory home. Montgomery, for his part, remained convinced to the end that his method had been superior. In his own memoirs, he wrote of the Bulge and the Rhine crossings with the same measured confidence he had displayed in January. He never admitted that the retention of Ninth Army had become a test he failed, not through incompetence, but through the very strength of his belief. He had not sought dominance out of vanity. He had sought it out of conviction that only his way could guarantee the victory without catastrophe. The fact that the war was won anyway did not change his mind. It merely proved, in his view, that his philosophy had been vindicated, despite interference. Eisenhower carried the knowledge alone. He had not defeated Montgomery in battle. He had not humiliated him in public. He had simply drawn a line, quietly, irrevocably, and enforced it. In doing so, he had preserved the coalition at the price of personal ambiguity. History would remember him as the architect of Allied unity, but it would never fully understand the moments when unity required him to become the man who said no. Decades later, when asked by a young historian why he had waited until April to return Ninth Army, Eisenhower gave the shortest answer of his life. Because I had to be sure. The alliance survived. The war was won, but the fracture that had opened in January 1945 never entirely closed. It remained as an invisible scar, between philosophies of war, between nations that had fought side by side, between two men who each believed they alone knew how victory should be shaped. Eisenhower did not defeat Montgomery. He limited him, and paid the price of knowing history might never fully understand why. Coalitions are not broken by enemies, but by certainty inside them. Subscribe for more moments when wars were decided far from the battlefield.